You're listening to the Fashion Ambition Podcast, and I'm your host, Natalie Robin. The Fashion Ambition Podcast is all about bringing you the tools and strategies to start and scale your business or career in fashion through conversations with industry experts who have been there and done that. Whether you're a startup founder, a new fashion graduate, or a soon-to-be graduate like me, or you just know that a career in fashion is your calling, we have an episode to help you launch. Make sure to keep up with new episodes by following the podcast at The Fashion Ambition on Instagram, where I update you on new episodes every week. You can also find my blog on Instagram at Nomad and Mode and online at nomadandmode.net, where I write all about fashion and travel. You can find all of the links to connect with me in the show notes. So with that, let's get into the episode. Hi, this is Natalie, and welcome to the Fashion Ambition Podcast. Today, I am so excited to be talking with Véronique Loewen, who is a PR and communications expert with over 25 years of experience. She is also the founder of Verolingo Communications, an English and French translation, communications, writing, and editing company. So I know that Véronique has so many great insights on how to approach PR and communications, and it is such an important foundation for a successful career just in general. So I am really looking forward to hearing her perspective on how new professionals and businesses should approach business and personal communications and PR. So welcome to the podcast, Véronique, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Fashion and communication.
Yeah.
Good combination.
Exactly. Two of our favorite things.
You bet.
So how would you personally, because this is a fashion-related podcast, how would you personally approach fashion in terms of like presenting yourself in a PR or communications capacity?
You know, I think that regardless of your capacity, whether it's, you're in a PR or communications role, whether you're the CEO or the nurse, or regardless of your background, I would say that fashion has to be authentic. It has to represent who you are. Me trying to dress, as somebody I'm not sends a message, And so if I dress very conservatively, but I'm somebody who's generally flamboyant, uses big words, big gesture, big smiles, right? And then I'm dressed like I'm going to a funeral. It doesn't jive, And so people sense that, they see that, and then you appear as inauthentic, even though your words, your facial expression, your gesture may be very authentic. Your attire is disconnected.
Right.
So I always tell people, be who you are, And yes, I mean, in certain circumstances, you have to dress a little bit up or a little bit down compared to what you would normally do. But that doesn't mean you have to totally switch it, totally deviate from who you are, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Because people can really pick up on that authenticity. And like you said, it's important that like how you speak and what your personality is like matches with how you're presenting yourself, like visually.
I would think, and at least it has worked for me, and it has worked with the people that I have coached on, what to wear at whatever event or at, for an interview or that sort of thing. Because again, it speaks for who you are. I mean, of course, if for example, you are going for an interview, a job interview, say, and you know that the organization you're going to is very conservative, you may want to check your wardrobe, make sure that you're actually going to, not scare them as soon as they see you,
Right.
Even though your personality might not quite fit, but, your knowledge and experience may be the perfect fit. So you don't want to scare them by your attire. get in the door first, and then maybe, see
Right.
what you can do, how far you can go with your attire. But so there's obviously circumstances where you have to be very conscious of what you're wearing and how it's perceived. But most often I would say be authentic.
Right.
Just, just be who you are in your attire. So if you're like me, not scared of color, then wear color,
Yeah.
um, if you are scared of color, then don't try to be something you're not, so yeah, I'd
Yeah.
say everything has to work together, not just your gesture, not just your wording and your expressions, your facial expression, etc. Everything has to work together.
Right. Right. And sometimes it's about tailoring your appearance to fit in whatever new environment you're going to step into, but in a way that's still authentic to you and still like reflects who you are and how you want to be perceived, really.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course I say that because maybe also because of, my age and my journey, but still, I think that, you can still be very much respectful of accepted norms wherever it is that you're going or entering, or whoever you're addressing. You can be respectful of those accepted norms and still be true to yourself.
Right.
It's just finding that balance, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. And then being aware of how other people are perceiving you too when you're stepping into their space. Right. So that kind of, I guess, touches on my next question, which is about presenting yourself in a social media space where you have to really be aware of how other people on those platforms are perceiving you. So, so my question is, what advice would you give somebody who is not quite sure of what to post, or maybe they need some questions to ask themselves before posting on social media to make sure that they're really representing themselves in the best way possible?
Yeah. And so really the first question, and I would think anybody who studied whether it's public relations or communications or marketing, and definitely if you studied crisis communication, the first question you ask yourself is, if this was on the front page of the newspaper, would you cringe? Would you be embarrassed? Would you cry? I mean, right. what kind of reaction would you have, right? And so, we refer to that. I'm sure you've seen it around and people have heard it, but people tend to forget it. And the fact is, it should be in the back of your mind all the time.
Right.
Because if that was in the back of your mind all the time, then chances are you wouldn't post nasty rants. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't be disrespectful, call people names, that sort of thing, right? You would actually think about what you're doing and probably tone it down. That doesn't mean you can't be irate. That doesn't mean you can be sad or disappointed. I mean, you can have all the gamut of emotions, but it's the manner in which you express them. And right. The thing is, with social media, once it's out there, you can't bring it back. I mean, yes, you can delete posts, but chances are somebody's already seen it, already shared it, already screen captured it, whatever. Yeah. I mean, so you have to be very conscious of what you do. So that would be the very first question, the one that actually stays in your mind. If you don't ask yourself anything else, ask yourself that, if this Definitely. Appears in the paper, and it doesn't have to be today, 10 years from now, am I going to be embarrassed by this thought?
Right. Right, for sure. And then, sorry, go ahead.
Regret it. Having said that, we all grow. I'm clearly not the same person as I was at 20 years old, as I was at 30 years old, etc. So we all grow. But within that growth, I would hope that, you remain respectful, that you remain, a community builder, rather than somebody who tears things apart, And so to me, who are you trying to be? Who are you? Who do you want people to see you as? And then based on that, then you can answer that question, right?
Right.
So if you're the type of person who wants to be, or who tries to always be a community builder, well, don't slam people left, right, and center when you're trying to build community.
Right.
You can still disagree without tearing people apart. And so to me, those are some of the things that you have to think about when posting on social media. You can be very strong in your positions and being a strong activist, and yet be respectful.
Right.
Definitely. And so to me, that's what people have to think. The other thing is, what's the value? So what are you putting out there? Who's going to pick it up? Who does it serve? Right?
Right.
What is the value? And I mean, sometimes the value is to you. I get that, but often the value to you is also value for somebody else. Right?
Right.
So if, let's say, simple post, personal post, you're sharing about beautiful walk you had down by the river, or that sort of thing. Well, the value is clearly to you. You had a wonderful moment. But sharing your joy, sharing your love of nature, that can also bring somebody else's joy.
Right.
Right. So again, what's the value? Right. So be conscious of that too. What is the value to you? What is the value to somebody else?
Right.
So, and then how that impacts others. Because people will react. So they can react positively or they can react negatively. What are you trying to attract? Another question you may ask yourself.
Right. So once somebody has, had those questions in their toolbox, so they've asked, like, what is the value of me posting this? Am I being respectful? Is this something that I would be comfortable with people seeing 10 years from now? So once they've done all of that, and they've got that in their toolbox, but maybe, something comes up in their business or something comes up in their personal, and they still end up, facing a crisis. So what would you say to somebody to have them avoid having an emotional reaction to having a personal or professional crisis?
I mean, this is something we all face at one point or another, whether it's in business or personally, because none of us are perfect. I mean, I'm saying all of this, but I'm also very conscious that we're all fallible.
Right.
And so if you find yourself in a position where you have to kind of reel the genie back, I would say the first is acknowledgement. So you may not have all the answers. You may not know how you're going to really handle things, but just acknowledge. And so just saying, for example, yesterday I posted this thought, or or my company did this. We're aware that may not have been the best thing to do. Or I'm aware that I probably shouldn't have said that. I don't have the answers yet, but leave it with me. And then that's it, right? And so you can just acknowledge. The acknowledgement is the first step. Sometimes you can acknowledge and also do the repair work at the same time, but it doesn't have to be combined. You could acknowledge and then say, leave it with me, or I'll be back soon. I need to think this through, And most people will give you the time to do that, actually. I mean, unless people are dying, then you don't have much time. Action is needed right now. But most of us aren't facing life or death. Right? It's more image or brand that gets tainted, right? And so then once you've acknowledged and said, you know what, let me be thoughtful about how I address this, then people will generally give you a few hours, a few days, depending on who you are. If you're Coca-Cola, they're giving you, less than an hour, minutes,
Yeah.
because you have a whole team behind you that can think on their feet like that, and then get to work. If you're a solopreneur or a startup with everybody's whatever, you probably have many hours, even days, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it
So
depends.
it's,
So it depends. It depends what situation you're in. But truthfully, then you come back and you say, you know what? Thinking about this, should have never said this. This is what I meant to say. This is how I was thinking it. I just didn't express myself carefully. I'm sorry for that. Expressing regret is also very important. So first you acknowledge, then you express regret and reparation. So reparation it could be, you know what, this is how I'm going to explain this instead, or this is what I'm going to do to make amends, or whatever, right? And so you can do that on a personal level or on a business level. On a business level, chances are you have a lot less time than on a personal level.
Right. So first step can be acknowledgement, and then depending on your situation, that may buy you some time, I guess.
Correct.
Right. So how would somebody start to build a crisis, like a PR crisis plan to begin with? Like what would the first step be? Like say they're not in a crisis yet, but they want to have that in their back pocket in case something does happen. How would they begin to build that, and then know what actions to take, like when something does come up?
Yeah, it's a good idea to have a crisis communication plan. It doesn't mean you're going to follow it to the letter.
Right.
Because every situation is so different, and we can't plan for every situation. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I would suggest that 99% of us didn't plan for a pandemic. Well, 99% of businesses, organizations of any kind, didn't plan for a pandemic, but they still had a communication plan. They still had a crisis plan overall beyond the communication plan. And so having a plan is a good idea. Now, knowing where to start, I would say start with some scenarios. So, for example, what would be your worst nightmare, as you can imagine? We're not talking pandemic here, but what would be your worst nightmare? Start with that. And then from there, go to the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next things. So, for example, if you're an airline company, your worst nightmare is probably some plane falling off the sky, right? What are the scenarios, and how would you address it? What are some of the things that you will need to do? Which is why I'm saying there's an overall crisis plan, and then there's a crisis communication plan. They're two different things. Your overall crisis is you're going to have to deal with, I don't know, loss of life, whatever, getting there, getting emergency response, those kind of things. That's your overall. And then the communication side, then you dive more into exactly what are some of the messages that you're going to use. But what are you using these messages for? They're very different. If, for example, you're in an industry that's very much regulated, you're going to have to talk to those regulatory agencies. You can't talk to them the same way as you're going to talk on Twitter, right? So your communication plans will have these pieces. What is the potential scenario? Who are your audiences? And there'll be many. Your internal people, for example, in a crisis, often people forget their internal team.
Right.
But they're probably the first one you should talk to, because essentially they're going to want to be answering for you. Maybe it's your front desk receptionist. Maybe it's your salesperson that gets a call, right? So your internal team, the regulatory bodies, your customers, your suppliers, and then the general public, as we call it, right? Like the people that follow you on Twitter and that you've never met, but, keep liking your stuff on Instagram, right?
Right.
So you're going to have different messaging for them about the same thing, because not everybody needs the same level of detail, right?
Right.
And so that's basically where you start. You start with a case.
Mm-hmm.
And then for each, there are though things that do not change. No matter what the crisis is, there are things that do not change. So for example, your organization or your personal values, those shouldn't change no matter what's
Right.
going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your organization is about quality, caring for the community, I don't know, you name it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those things will be part of your crisis communication plan as well, because those things don't change.
Right.
If you pride yourself and if part of your branding is that you're a company that puts safety first, even in a crisis where clearly safety had an issue,
Right.
you should still put safety first,
Mm-hmm.
right? So coming out and saying, you know what, we just had an incident. 2 of our employees have been injured. The other 300 are safely home,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
That doesn't change. Your value is still that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are things in no matter what the crisis is, they won't change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you're a company for community engagement and involvement and support is important, well, that's also part of that. Right?
Right.
You're not going to leave that behind in your communication. It's not because you're in the middle of a crisis that your value system changes.
Right.
It should be addressed as part of your crisis plan, right?
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so for your personal image, same deal. So I've been talking a lot about, if you're in business, but for your personal image, it's the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. And that was actually another question that I had for you was like, how important do you think it is to build a personal communications and PR and even like a personal crisis plan too, like for your own like individual image? And how would you go about doing that?
I would say, so for sure, if you can, that's something you should at least think of. If you don't take the time to put it on paper, but it should be something that you think of. So you start with what is the perception that you want to push out there,
Mm-hmm.
that you want people to see you as. And so if you know who you are and how you want to be perceived, first of all, check that people are actually perceiving you like that, right?
Right.
So if you've been, acting a certain way, dressing a certain way, doing certain things, at some point, you should check that what you think you're putting out is what people are receiving, because it's not always the same and it's not always true.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
definitely.
ask friends,
Mm-hmm.
ask people that know you, ask your friends, ask your family members, ask people that who you trust aren't going to sugarcoat, because there's that too. People will often tell you what you want to hear. So ask trusted people that won't, won't sugarcoat it, won't doctor it up for you. Will tell you point blank, well, yeah, that doesn't come across very good,
Yeah.
Or by the way, when you wear this kind of clothes, you diminish your whatever,
Mm-hmm.
So use that, get the feedback.
Right.
And then once you know that what you're attempting to put out, that who you believe you are and that you want people to perceive you as, once you're confident in that, then you can say, okay, now, if I falter, if I deviate, if I have a lapse of judgment,
Yeah.
or I find myself in a situation where I totally react inappropriately, etc., how am I going to address that? What is the best way for me to get people to actually forgive me, give me grace, whatever terminology you want to use, but not hold on to that sidestep.
Right.
Right. And so you can start thinking, okay, what does that look like? So if you're, if you're somebody who's normally very caring, etc., and then somebody, Snapchat you punching somebody else, that's not good.
No.
Right? You're going to have to explain that.
Mm-hmm.
And said, and maybe give out the circumstances, how you lost your temper. Maybe it's something that happens more than once. So now you have to explain what you're doing to remedy that, et cetera, right? So to me, knowing, having at least an idea, whether you put it on paper, but having at least an idea of what are some of the things that could happen. So for example, if you know you have an issue with your temper, but yet you're somebody who's normally so gentle, right? So if that side of you might surface, but you've been working on it, have a plan for the day that it will surface, and then that you'll have to address it, right? Think, okay, what would I say? What would I do? Of course, you're trying not to do it, but it may happen, right? And so I would say it's just formulating in our head, just like we would, for a company. What are some of those messages? What are my values? And then reinforce that. Put that behavior out. Reinforce those values. Now, what I see often is for many of us, our work life and persona and our personal side blend and get blurred. Right?
Okay.
Many of us represent our company. So when we talk about public relations, communications, marketers, often we find ourselves in the position where we represent the company. People associate us with the organization, right? If it's a for-profit, non-profit, whatever, right? People associate us with the organization. And so you can't always differentiate the two.
Right.
Which now you have to make sure when this is the case that you actually really believe who you're working for.
Right.
And that your values align with the values of the company. Because if they don't, now you're in a conundrum. Right?
Yeah. And that's become even more so of an issue now because with social media, you're constantly being connected with whoever it is that you're working for. So you really have to be aware of whether or not that company's values actually align with your values. I think that that's really important. And also your point about asking people whether or not what you're putting out there is actually aligned with how people are perceiving you is really, I think, really smart, because I don't think people typically do that. And then when they're getting this feedback that's like not aligned with how they want to be seen, they get really, I think it kind of puts you into a defensive mode where you're like, oh, well, I'm not like that. But maybe you really are coming across that way. So having that feedback is really, really valuable, because then you can then adjust to make sure that you are coming across like in alignment with your values. So yeah, I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Again, I mean, we're in an era, and answering this question might have been totally different 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, for sure. Yeah. But in this era where we're pretty much under a microscope all the time, one of the things that we have to learn somehow is consistency. Even though people will forget and will forgive, but generally you should try to be consistent in your behavior, in your thought process. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind,
right?
But the way you approach things can be consistent. I've changed my mind on a lot of things, particularly last year, but it doesn't mean that I'm a different person or that I approach things differently. It just means that I've taken the time to think, about other parameters, right? And so we have to be conscious of that. We have to think, okay, am I pushing out there what I want people to receive from me? You know?
Right, definitely. Yeah, that consistency point is also a really good thing to be constantly thinking about too. So what time are we? Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. So I just want to be mindful of the time here. And so another question that I really wanted to get to actually, and you can decide on how specific you want to be, but I was wondering if you have an example of when PR really saved a situation, or the way that PR was handled really kind of patched things up, because I think it's kind of interesting to see from the inside, because a lot of the times we see these situations from the outside. We don't actually see how it was managed behind the scenes. So I was wondering if you have an example of that.
Oh, well, I mean, I've watched many situations, get handled beautifully. So not being in behind the scenes, but watching it with my own professional eye and thinking, wow, they're doing a bang on job. So I've seen that happen. I've also seen many cases where I went, oh my gosh, please give me a call.
Yeah.
But for me, I would say, when I try to think of situations that where we've kind of, thought, okay, it's kind of doom and gloom, and then, but let's save the day. Really, when I look at that, I would say it was situations, and I can't give you particulars, but basically what I've seen work is when every piece, so now we're back into the professional realm, is when every part of the organization works towards the common goal, which is number one, of course, ending the crisis, but not just ending the crisis, giving reparation, basically coming out of it in a good way on both sides. The people that suffered the crisis, and then the people that were thrown in it because it's their business or it's their crew or whatever. And so when everybody behind the scene works together, really good things can happen. The other thing is, for me, timeliness is super, super important.
Okay.
And what often happens in organizations, so if we talk about public relations and communications, what often happens in organizations is they don't want to talk publicly until they have all the pieces. Okay. It may take days. Sometimes it may take months. It could take years. I mean, when we talk about, for example, plane crashes, it could take years to have all the answers after all the investigations. So what? You're going to for years to talk? No. Timeliness is super, super important. And so to me, the crisis that were handled the best, they started with timeliness. They started by, acknowledging very quickly. Saying, we have an issue, we are aware, we're on it, we'll get back to you ASAP. Right? And then, as fast as they could, they found out a little bit of information and then came back and said, oh, we just learned that this and this and this, and once we get more, we'll be back. Right. And then go off. And that, keeping people updated, letting them know that you care, that you're on top of it, that you're managing, that you're doing your best. That's super, super important. And every single crisis, whether it was ones that I was part of or ones that I observed that were handled the best, it doesn't mean that the outcome was, that the crisis itself was something that was pleasant. No, by any means. But the outcome could have been 10 times worse if they hadn't been timely in their communication. right?
Right.
In addressing the public, right?
Right.
And so to me, it takes to achieve that, it takes really teamwork internally. It takes people understanding that whenever you get a little bit of information, you need to let the next person know, the person that's going to be representing you, whether it's on social media or in front of the camera, TV cameras, or the radio mics, right?
Mm-hmm.
It also takes leadership. It takes your leadership to realize, you know what? Yes, we won't have all of the answers, but we'll give what we can
Right.
as soon as we can, right?
Right. So,
And you don't have to be careless doing that. I mean, you don't want to give too much information either, because people will latch on to that, right? And you may scare them unnecessarily, or you may have to walk back stuff if you give out too much information. So trying to find that balance, but that also takes teamwork, right?
right.
And so to me, if you have a cohesive organization, then you can make that work, right?
Okay.
Now talking about personal crisis, the timeliness, same thing, right?
Right.
Now you're one person, so you may not have an army behind you to help you with this, but it doesn't mean you can't be timely and say, you know what, I'm trying to deal with this, I'll be back, right?
Right.
And then you talk to whoever you need to talk to, your lawyer, your accountant, whomever, right?
Right. So it's addressing it, even if you don't have a solution right away. It's making sure that people know that you're thinking about it, that you recognize it as an issue, and then that you're communicating internally, like with your team, or just, if you're solo and you're having, a personal issue, that you're making sure that you're communicative with whoever is involved. So all of that is really, I've never thought of it quite that way. So that's really helpful, I think. And then also what you touched on earlier with knowing what your values are ahead of time, and then being able to work back from that. Because I don't think that that's necessarily something, if you don't work in PR or communications, that might not be something that you think of. And so if you do end up in kind of like a sticky situation, knowing that, okay, these are my values, this is what I fall back on, this is how I want to be perceived, is really, really, really important. So I'm just getting to my last question here. So one thing that I always like to ask people is, what is some advice that you would give yourself when you're first getting started in your professional career? Because this is a podcast for people who are just getting started, whether they want to be entrepreneurs or they're just trying to get their foot in the door in the fashion industry. So what is some advice you would have given yourself?
I would say, first, again, just like we started, we'll end like we started. First, be authentic. Authenticity goes a long way, really.
Right.
And I would imagine in the fashion industry particularly, we all try to have these personas and wear these outfits and promote whatever fashion sense we have, but really it's about authenticity in doing that. The next thing is be humble, particularly when you start out. You may have the best idea ever since sliced bread, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the best thing ever, but be humble about it. People will gravitate more towards somebody who says, you know what, I have this massive idea, but I need you. I need your help. I need your expertise, right? To take it to the next level, or to help me deploy it like I think it should be deployed, right? So have some humility, even when you know you've got a winner, right?
Right.
And same with when you sell yourself. You may have the greatest experience. You may have worked in the best fashion houses and or already had product to market that went, totally viral or whatever. but that doesn't mean you can't learn. We're all learning. I continue to learn. I continue to read, to listen, to, to evolve, to talk to people that have more knowledge, more experience, right? So having that humility is also something that's big.
Right.
It doesn't mean you shouldn't be proud of your accomplishments. You can still be proud, but there's a way of being proud and yet saying, you know what, I don't know it all.
Right,
I
definitely.
have achieved this. I got my degree, but I still have so much to learn. Right? So to me, those are two aspects that we seriously need to think about. So I'd probably tell myself that. I'd say, because I used to be very rambunctious and then just ram it in and now I look at that and I think, oh my gosh, first of all, I wasted so much energy. But on top of that, is it again who I want to be seen as? I'm not that person, And I mean, and if you are that person, then be all of that, and explain why you're all of that, right?
Right.
But if that's not really you, then don't do that because you diminish yourself.
Right. And also if it's not really you, then you won't be able to keep up that energy for that long too. And then people will see that kind of like incongruence. That's the word I'm looking for. So people can kind of pick up on that. But and I think that humility and authenticity, both of those pieces are really important. To speak to the humility point, it's like part of it is being able to like work in a team and acknowledge that other people have this expertise and experience too. So you don't have to come in pretending that you know everything or feeling like you have to know everything either.
I would say a friend of mine said that the other day, and I was like, that she nailed it. That was exactly that. Is that, whether you're an entrepreneur or, you work for an organization, knowing that there are likely people that can do certain things better than you can, and then letting them handle those pieces. Right. And then you handle, what you're really good at. And so being able to recognize that and use that is really a gift. Because first of all, it'll save you probably time, probably money in the long run, because they can do it better, faster. And it will also bring you respect because people will respect you for actually recognizing that there are others that are better than you at certain things, and so that you can focus on the things you're good at. People will also recognize you for being a team player, right? And for surrounding yourself with the best people, right? Definitely. And delegating, right? Nobody likes somebody who hoards the knowledge and the power and the kudos, right? And so all of that gets back to you if you do it well. So I would say it's important. The other thing is, and in fashion, probably just like in public relations and communication and marketing, I'm sure you've heard the term spin. For the longest time, people didn't trust marketers, didn't trust PR people, didn't trust communication people, because yes, it was all about spin. How are we going to spin this thing so that it's viewed in the light, in the right light, even if it's no good, right? That's what spin is. Okay. Right? And that was for many years, that's how things got done. We knew the company wasn't doing good over here, but we'd spin it so that it appears or whatever. That doesn't fly today. Right. It absolutely does not fly. And I see people still trying to do this thing, and I don't get it. People need to own who they are and what they do. So if your company does something that's not really, I'd say, I don't know, correct, or that the popular view might not really like, etc., then find the positive, find, why is it that they need to actually be doing that? What is the explanation that people can understand?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to saying, wow, trying to
spin it. Yeah.
Right. And so to me, whether it's in fashion or anything else, in PR, it's about being true, because if you are true and if what you say is true and what you portray is true, people will believe it. And so they should,
Right.
and then you won't disappoint them. And then it won't be difficult. It'll be exactly what you need to be doing.
Right. So you'll be coming from that solid foundation of authenticity, and you won't have to spin anything. You won't have to backtrack anything that you've said previously, because you're always working off of this really strong foundation of your values and that authenticity. So yeah. So it's really, really great advice. I want to be respectful of your time here. So yeah. I'll wrap it up there, but thank you so much for spending the time with me. And this was really, really great. I feel like I learned so much, and I could ask you so many more questions, but.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And anytime. I think that one of the things that this era, this technology field era has given us is that the power to be able to share with people that we may never meet, but maybe they pick up a little nugget, and so I look forward to listening to your podcast and also learning as I go along.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronique.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Fashion Ambition podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Veronique's services in communication, translation, writing, and editing, you can check out her website at verolingo.com. You can also find the link in the show notes. If you liked this episode, make sure to leave a review, and if you got any great takeaways, I would love to hear your feedback. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram at nomadandmode, and follow the podcast page at The Fashion Ambition to be updated whenever there's a new episode. I know that I always learn so much from each of the guests on the podcast, and I would love to know what stood out most to you. So feel free to tag me on Instagram with a screenshot of this episode and let me know what you learned. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode of The Fashion Ambition.